Superhero stories are nothing without villains to fight, and there are some great ones out there in the land of comic books. They just don't always quite live up to expectations on the big screen. With the Marvel Universe being full of characters that have decades of history behind them, many have surprisingly layered personalities, lofty ambitions, and have performed some impressive feats in the comics, which then never get translated properly to the big screen, leaving them feeling just a little bit deflated. Whether it's because some of their more out there premises get dialed back to keep things realistic, or because they don't get enough screen time to matter, or their ambitions have been scaled down, it's always a shame to see this happen. So let's take a look at what MCU villains could have been so much better. To say that the MCU Taskmaster that we got in the Black Widow movie last year was a bit of a letdown would be putting it mildly. The skull-faced mercenary is one of Marvel's most beloved villainous characters after all. This is due to many factors like his personality, his professional approach to his job, the awesome almost ghost pirate look to his costume, and his incredible photographic reflexes that allow him to mimic every other character's skills to perfection. All of this together makes for a striking and entertaining villain who can give many superheroes a run for their money. And then in Black Widow we got a silent, brainwashed woman with a very vaguely skull-patterned helmet who just so happens to be kind of good at some of the same things that some of the Avengers can do. Huh? It's not even that it doesn't make sense for Natasha to fight another Widow-like character given the film's themes of exploitation of women, but surely there had to be a better way to handle it than this. So instead of shaking up a villain that had little going for them in terms of character like Ghost did in Ant-Man and the Wasp, this just takes a beloved comic book villain known for his banter and stops one step short of giving him the full X-Men Origins Deadpool treatment. Captain America. One of Marvel's flagship superheroes created to represent all the most virtuous parts of the American ideal. The Red Skull. A grinning, menacing-looking military leader hell-bent on causing as much destruction as possible and crushing all opposition under his heel. These two have gone at it for many decades, far beyond their World War II origins, and Red Skull has established himself as one of the vilest villains in comic book history because of it. And in the MCU, he kinda just had the antagonist role in a mildly interesting Phase 1 movie. Now, don't get me wrong, Captain America First Avenger is fine, and Hugo Weaving certainly comes off as imposing with his portrayal and some great prosthetic work. But he ends up just showing up, making Cap's origin story happen, and then disappearing only to, reappear on Vormir as some weird ghost thing who tells people to pretty please not try and take the Soul Stone. What a weird development. It's a far cry from the maniacal archenemy of Captain America, who exists solely to destroy everything the good Captain holds dear, that's for sure. Speaking of the Red Skull, boy did the MCU drop the ball when it comes to adapting one of his most prominent followers. I am of course talking about Brock Rumlow, better known as Crossbones. MCU viewers probably remember him as the skull mask guy who wrecks things at the beginning of Captain America Civil War, before getting himself blown up and dying just as fast as he arrived. It makes for an exciting opening act to be sure, and Crossbones' coup does set the rest of the film's plot in motion, so it's not that his appearance doesn't hold some weight. And much like Hugo Weaving, Frank Grillo certainly delivers in his short screen time, but it just doesn't hold a candle to the comic book version. In the comics, he is not only one of the Red Skull's most loyal and competent followers, he's also an impressively skilled and brutal fighter who has managed to beat the Captain in hand-to-hand combat on occasion. But in the MCU, he's honestly a kind of run-of-the-mill terrorist who just likes to put skulls on things and never even meets the Red Skull. He almost comes across more like a 12-year-old painting flames on his bike because he thinks it makes him look cool, rather than the terrifying fascist enforcer he's supposed to be. Sticking with the big bad military organizations for a while, Hydra is home to many impressive villains in the comics, such as its big top gun, Baron Wolfgang von Strucker, whose very name just reeks of power and menace. You'd think that being the leader of Hydra, getting his own post-credit scene at the end of Captain America Winter Soldier, and having decades of history being a pain in Cap, Nick Fury, and all of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s backside in the comics, he'd get to really strut his stuff once he actually made an appearance in the MCU. But instead, he appears in 2 scenes in Age of Ultron, is a sniveling coward, and then gets killed off-screen by the title villain before he can even adjust his monocle. With how little of an impression he ends up leaving, it's easy to forget that he's the guy who authorized the experiments that gave Pietro and Wanda their powers in the MCU, meaning that without him, we wouldn't have gotten the widely beloved WandaVision series at all. Now compare this to the comics, where Strucker is a skilled swordsman, wields a powerful electric gauntlet called Satan's Claw, and has superpowers and healing abilities thanks to the Death Spore virus inside of him. Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, the MCU audience was absolutely robbed. And since we're on the subject of one of Marvel's most divisive movies, let's take a look at the big clanking hunk of metal that headlines it. Ultron. Now, I'm not gonna claim that Ultron wasn't a threat in the film that bears his name. Far from it. Housing the combined intellect and scientific prowess of Tony Stark and Bruce Banner in this continuity, he's packed to the brim with power and weaponry and really wrecks things once he decides that humanity needs to be wiped off the face of the earth. And James Spader's performance is certainly something to behold, lending a fantastic voice to the robotic menace. So far so good, but he just never reaches the same height of absolute genocidal madness that comic book Ultron does. Comics Ultron set his sights on eradicating humanity almost from the moment he booted up, and he spends very little time fooling around between coming up with ways to kill as many people as possible in one go. This is a character that can normally take hits from Thor without even scratching the paint job, who in the movies gets the crap kicked out of him by Cap and ends up being taken down by Vision of all people. That is when he isn't too busy cracking jokes that the original Ultron would never waste his time on coming up with in the first place. Yeah, there's definitely some Tony in there. And at the end of the day, what did Ultron even accomplish in his own movie? He killed a new character before the audience got a chance to give half a can of beans about him, and then nobody bothered to mention that this happened at all until WandaVision rolled around 6 years later. Not the strongest showing. Okay, hands in the air. Who here remembers anything Malekith actually did in Thor Dark World? The first Thor sequel holds the dubious honor of being one of the most commonly forgotten about movies in the MCU. Not necessarily the worst or the most hated, mind you, but just the one that never gets brought up in conversation, because there just isn't a lot to say about it. There's a bad guy who wants to destroy Asgard, Thor stops him, and that's more or less it. This is a shame when we're dealing with a setting as potentially interesting as Asgard, and a villain as wicked as Malekith the Accursed. Comic book Malekith, a skilled sorcerer and king of the Dark Elves, makes for one of Thor's greatest foes by sheer virtue of his sadism and his manipulative ways. This is a guy who likes to provoke Thor into a near murderous rage just because it amuses him, and who takes gleeful delight in just being as big of a bastard as he possibly can to absolutely anyone within arm's reach. In a lot of ways, he's essentially what Loki would be if he had none of his redeeming qualities, which is probably why he was changed so drastically in Dark World to avoid the series repeating itself. That's understandable from a writing standpoint, but then why not simply give someone else from Thor's Rogues Gallery a turn instead of doing Malekith dirty? I don't know, but earning a reputation as one of the MCU's most boring villains has got to hurt. Going from movies to TV shows, there are plenty of things to like about the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And plenty of things to scratch your head at, including the show's villain, Karli Morgenthau. Where her comic book counterpart Karl Morgenthau, the Flag Smasher, was hell-bent on destroying the very concept of a world divided by nations, Karli instead attempts to fight for the rights of those that were displaced by the snap, and now found themselves thrown back into a world that failed to take care of them after the return. That someone would take offense to this and form a group to fight back does make sense, and seeing a sympathetic villain develop characteristics not unlike those she claims to oppose can certainly be interesting. But Karli never quite manages to deliver. Rather than being a bombastic and passionate leader with a lofty goal like the original Flag Smasher, Karli sulks around and mutters to herself about injustice until she occasionally remembers to mention that she's willing to kill to achieve her goal. And then she still acts surprised about it when she actually does kill a superhero. You have to wonder how she managed to command such loyalty when, until the final confrontation at least, she barely comes across like she wants to even be there. Sticking with this show for a bit, the Power Broker is hardly a big-time villain that everyone who's ever picked up a comic book can name drop within a second. But he's not only important to the creation of John Walker in the comics, who would go on to become the dark reflection of Captain America known as the US Agent, he's also just a very interesting concept. In a world full of superpowered individuals, it makes perfect sense that some opportunistic, corrupt business type would try to peddle superpowers to any crook willing to cough up enough cash. It's an idea that's so interesting that it's been used twice in the comics. Long after the death of the original power broker Curtis Jackson, a second power broker who parodied modern tech and social media billionaires menaced Scott Lang for a while. He didn't just sell superpowers to anyone who wanted them, he also created an app that allowed crime bosses to quickly hire other villains so they could distract those pesky heroes while they got down to their real goal. It was essentially an Uber for supervillains, as he himself called it. This concept is a ton of fun. So what did the MCU do with it? They gave it to Sharon Carter so they could pull a shocking plot twist by revealing that Peggy's great niece is like totally super evil now. It seems kind of out of left field, but oh well, let's see where they take it from here. Ulysses Klaw is not on this list due to not being memorable. Far from it. With Andy Serkis' portrayal and playing a fairly big part in the Black Panther film, the one-handed mercenary certainly left an impression, and he is considered by many to be a bit of a highlight. The problem is that in terms of Black Panther villains, he's supposed to be so much more. After all, in the comics, this guy is basically T'Challa's archenemy on account of, killing his dad, which is what spurred him to become the Black Panther in the first place. It's cool to see Klaw blast things with his sonic arm cannon in the movie and all, but comics Klaw is so much more of a powerhouse, even if he does admittedly look kinda silly. Aside from wielding a devastating weapon, an incident involving his equipment resulted in his body turning into pure sound, rendering him nigh unkillable and making him capable of performing a wide variety of sonic-based attacks, on top of already possessing superhuman strength. But alas, in the Black Panther movie, he spends most of it playing the henchman to the admittedly very engaging Killmonger, who ends up betraying and killing him once he has outlived his usefulness, wasting any potential for him to claim his arch-enemy status. But hey, at least he didn't succumb to the same frustrating trope that Killmonger and the next villain on our list did. The first Ant-Man film introduced a character that, at the time, was quite unlike every other superhero in the MCU, both in terms of power set and personal life. He was more of an everyman than all the super soldiers, guards, secret agents, and scientists that populated the Avengers at the time, who also happened to be a really good cat burglar. Look man, we all need hobbies. And Corey Stoll, depicting the film's villain Darren Cross, delivers a heck of an entertaining performance, being not just a despicable, corrupt business type, but one that increasingly gets more and more deranged as the pimp particles seem to negatively affect his mind. He's engaging to watch, he's utterly cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs by the end, and he even gets a bit of a yearning for Hank Pym's approval to make his motivations a bit more engaging than just being greedy for the sake of being greedy. And then he puts on the Yellowjacket outfit and becomes yet another in a long line of boring dark doppelganger villains that are oh so common in superhero movies. Compare this to the comics version, whose attempts to cure his heart condition mutated him to a hulking mountain of superpowered muscle, causing him to literally steal homeless people's hearts in order to stay alive. Yeah, it's a bit more interesting than a vaguely bee-themed evil twin, isn't it? Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings did a lot of cool things for the MCU. Not only did it introduce a martial arts hero who has existed in the comics since the 1970s, it even washed out the bad taste of the Mandarin debacle from Iron Man 3 by giving us a new take on the guy without sticking to the less sensitive aspects of the original character. And it did all that while still acknowledging the existence of the fake Mandarin played by Ben Kingsley. But it really missed the mark when it came to adapting the Dweller in Darkness. In the comics, the Dweller in Darkness is a being more ancient than the Marvel Universe itself. It's one of the Fear Lords, a group of demons that power themselves on the fear of mortals and intend to cover the earth in never-ending terror. That sounds horrifying and incredibly cool. And then in Shang-Chi, he's just a dragon that somebody claims eats souls. A really freaking cool looking dragon, but still. We went from a terrifying ancient demon that eats fear to a dragon that the hero fights while we get yet another scene of two armies screaming and running at each other on a big field. It's not a great trade. Boy, the elementals from Far From Home sure were a thing, huh? It's totally in character for Mysterio to come up with this convoluted interdimensional nonsense. But not only do they have nothing to do with the actual group of villains from the comics called the Elementals, they barely even resemble the characters that they're actually inspired by. A lot of people already know this, but the MCU Elementals were instead based on a number of lesser-known Spider-Man villains, and while Sandman got a great portrayal in both Spider-Man 3 and No Way Home, and nobody gives a damn about any version of Cyclone, I mean seriously, who the heck even are these guys? The other two got thoroughly shafted. Like Molten Man here. This giant glob of holographic lava is based on the Spider-Man villain Mark Raxton, who spilled an experimental alloy on his skin, resulting in him becoming the Molten Man. This guy is basically a walking disaster area thanks to the heat and radiation that his metallic skin generates. Raxton had plenty of run-ins with Spider-Man in his search for a cure, only to eventually be redeemed and become one of Spidey's allies. Of course, given that this thing was a fake, it's not impossible for a proper Molten Man to show up someday, but I wouldn't hold my breath. And then there's the last elemental, and the only one that actually gets name-dropped. Morris Bench, the Hydro Man. Like Flash tells us after the attack in Venice, Hydro Man used to be an ordinary sailor who fell into the sea during one of Spidey's adventures, right as a new experimental energy generator was being tested underwater. This turned him into a living being made entirely of water, and he vowed revenge on Spider-Man for giving him superpowers that still allow him to look like a totally normal dude. Yeah, I don't get it either. So yeah, like I said, the Far From Home take has very little to do with the actual character. But then, not living up to his potential is already kind of Hydro Man's whole deal. Morris would be more than able to pose a massive threat, if he wasn't too stupid and lacking an ambition to do anything interesting with his powers. Heck, freaking Liquidator from the Darkwing Duck cartoon uses the same powers more creatively than he does. But that's kind of what helps make Hydro Man entertaining. Like Molten Man, there is still potential for Morris to show up, especially considering he got name-dropped, but for now, we're just gonna have to make do with this vaguely similar illusion. Well, at least not all hope is lost for all of these characters just yet, and they could potentially make their way back to the MCU to redeem themselves. I mean, if they can manage to get Batroc and the Mandarin second tries, why not some of these guys? Just don't pull another Taskmaster, please? Please?